Hi, everyone. I'm quite pleased today to be talking to someone I've long admired, Stephen Windmueller. Professor Windmueller is a Professor Emeritus at HUC. He is the former executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Los Angeles, Alpha Shalom. He's also really one of the most thoughtful people in the Jewish world. He writes prolifically about trends in the Jewish community, and particularly in the Jewish advocacy and community relations world. Many of us regard him as sort of the philosopher of Jewish community relations, and he writes articles that have really helped us think through the challenges. And I certainly relied on him when I was at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. And similarly, now that I'm doing the work I'm doing, fighting the imposition of ideology and protecting liberalism, I've noticed that Steve has sort of opined on some of those issues as well. So, Steve, I'm really grateful to be able to talk about these issues with you today.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Sure. So, you wrote a piece recently in Times of Israel, sort of on the American Jewish liberal reckoning, I think you called it. And you also had a previous piece not too long ago in E-Jewish Philanthropy, which cited some of the same trends in I think a broader context. And I was very struck by those pieces, and I think I probably agreed with almost everything in them. You write about how mainstream Jewish Democrats, moderate Jewish Democrats, are increasingly politically homeless, that they're feeling sort of the squeeze. They don't have an easy place to go on the right, so they're not like going to leave, join a populist Trump-based Republican Party, but they're increasingly uneasy within the Democratic consensus. What's happening within the sort of center-left that is bringing that to bear?
Well, I think that part of this is actually tied to some historic framework, meaning that the Jewish contribution to democratic liberal thought covers a wide period of time and a broad span of ideas. And as that evolved, that is, as Jews contributed to the thinking of the modern Democratic Party during the last 30 to 50 years, much of the behavior of the party and its candidates reflected some of these core values of interest to Jewish Americans. But as we have seen of late, there is a growing shift inside the Democratic circles that points to a different direction, at least for many mainline Jewish Democrats. Part of that has been brought on by the changing demographics we see in the nation, the changing composition of some of the elected officials and their own stories and their own connections, not only to Jewish Americans, but to certain democratic values where maybe they come to this from a different place. And finally, I think it is reflective of the fact that the interests of the Jewish community have always been, in a sense, modulated, meaning, yes, Jews are liberal, overwhelmingly so, but that liberalism is always measured and thoughtful in the context of extremist views are pushed against, or views that seem to run counter to the either Jewish interests or to what I guess one would call even broader American interests, are also responded to in a way that the Jewish community sees itself as kind of a force for temperance or modulation in a way that allows it to retain both its identity, but also to advance what I guess it perceives as its self-interest.
You write in the piece about what I talk a lot about, which is cancel culture. I don't know if you use, I can't remember if you use the phrase woke or wokeness or woke ideology or critical race theory. I think you do use that term at some point. How does that come to play here?
Yeah, I mean, as The Economist and other publications have recently suggested, there's a kind of illiberalism taking place. That is, this is no longer true liberal practice and liberal dynamics in play. There's a kind of orthodoxy of expression or behavior happening that if you do not agree with us, or if you hold contrarian views, even if those views are well measured and thoughtful, or at least ought to be debated, you're somehow rejected as either being racist or is somehow out of touch with contemporary political reality, at least in the minds of some. And so this kind of orthodoxy is really troubling. It speaks to the fact that if you don't understand or see the reality that what Israel is doing to its Palestinian brothers and sisters is the same as what is happening in the United States around the issues of race, then you certainly are out of touch with the current reality. So this intersectionality piece is highly problematic because it links all victims together and does not allow for a kind of discrete and historic understanding that each case or each situation warrants its own dimensions or considerations. And critical race theory and other such views seem to create a kind of lockstep behavior of what is expected of people. And if you're white, for example, you may not even be able to fully appreciate or understand some of the issues at hand, and therefore you're dismissed out of hand as somehow not being necessarily relevant to the conversation. So all of this and more seem to suggest that where many Jews are in terms of their political perspectives, their views on civil rights, their ideas about civility and culture are somehow sort of outside the mainstream. And thereby this rejectionism is particularly apparent and becomes that much more difficult for many of us, if you wish to be able to function with responsible and necessary partners in conversations that need attention and ought to be addressed. So it's not that we are saying that there aren't racial issues in America that have to be handled and ought to be, and that there are problems with the police, and there are issues on immigration, and that there are hosts of other considerations that all of us need to be embracing. But the language and the limitations offered to us by some on the very far left are really drawing lines that simply don't permit our part of the conversation to be embraced.
So we're both former practitioners in a way. I'm still doing community relations, but slightly differently than I used to. And, I'm not that long out of the community relations field. And one of my critiques of particularly the last year and a half since George Floyd, but before that, was that there was this enormous pressure both inside the Jewish community, particularly in the progressive wing of the Jewish community, but even within the community relations movements, to start to be fully aligned with what we considered our progressive allies. That we wanted desperately to be part of what we might consider the new civil rights movement. And that meant falling into line on some of these issues. I'll give you an example. In 2016, I wrote an article urging the Jewish community to get involved in Black Jewish relations and particularly criminal justice reform. But at the very end of the piece, I suggested that the Jewish community should come in its own voice and not feel that it has to stipulate to views such as America is a white supremacist country. And what I found was that actually many of our colleagues, some, not all, but some, were quite willing to toe that line in the end. I wasn't. And I don't believe that America is a white supremacist country. That doesn't mean we don't have plenty of racism, and I think there's a very rich and robust conversation that should happen with about how much and where racism exists and what it defines and what it doesn't define and the like. I'm taken by that. Now, that may not be representative of where the larger Jewish community is. Do you have a sense of where things are going? Let's say I don't mean in the far left. I think we understand where the far left is, or the far right, but where the mainstream community is likely to land on these issues.
Well, I actually think that many American Jews are simply confused, troubled, and uncertain about all of these sort of choices on language, the requirement to somehow adopt or abide by a certain set of codes of belief. So it has, in a sense, frozen or stymied some within the mainstream Jewish community to figure out, how do we play? How do we participate? That's principle number one. And principle number two, that for many American Jews, they are not even sure with whom they ought to be sort of engaging. They don't necessarily understand Black Lives Matter, for example. They're not sure whom else they ought to be speaking with inside or outside of the African American community. And they're unclear as to really what are the pathways forward to open a dialogue or to create conversation or to create action. I don't think it's that American Jews are not willing to act on behalf of injustice. I just think that in this particular frame of reference, it is much more complicated and uncertain.
Yes, indeed. So you've also spent a lot of years in the academic world, particularly among Jews, and I'm not sure how you feel about talking a little bit about that, but I certainly have observed that younger Jewish academics and rabbis and the like have increasingly embraced this ideology. Are you able to share anything on your own observations there?
I will tell you a story without naming the communities or the players, but I was invited to speak to a group of rabbis prior to the high holidays in terms of some of the issues that I was seeing as a result of the Pew study on American Jews and its implications for community policy and for assisting rabbis in particular in terms of thinking about messaging. What could they say and how might they say it? And it was very clear that this group of rabbis, comprised of all the different denominations, were deeply divided over even the language and the ways by which one addresses or confronts some of these questions. So it came to a head in the sense that certain trigger words were offered where there's this pushback about, in a sense, there's a kind of new language that has to be used if you're going to speak with or talk to this sort of crowd of younger rabbinic leaders who will only, in a sense, embrace a particular set of words and ideas because the old language, as I might frame it, is simply too conservative or too anachronistic to fit their sensibilities. And so it was clear, even amongst these colleagues, that there was a deeper division where, to the point you could not find even common language to identify the problem, because one group found it to be so out of touch with what they perceive to be the new sort of code words for behavior and responsibility, and where the rest of us seemingly were left in the dust because we somehow spoke a language that did not abide by these new principles.
Yes, indeed, and we see it manifest all the time, and we're trying to figure out how to navigate it. You speak of a third way I think I don't know if you use the term strategic reset. It's a term that I'm using in some of the writing that's coming out in the future about community relations, about Jewish advocacy. How do you think mainstream Jewish institutions should move forward politically in this current very tumultuous strategic political environment?
Well, I mean, one possibility, and it may be a bit treacherous, but it might be the requirement that's necessary, is that the mainstream institutions and its leadership create a manifesto of exactly what we do believe, to affirm, many of the principles about what community relations needs to address and what our agenda ought to be and why we have a stake in all of this, but that it also sets some of the boundaries about, well, on one hand, it's the use of language, but on other, it's a far more deeper consideration about, we're simply not going to be able to buy the storyline or the fix that's on this is the only way forward. I mean, we believe, and we have to convey that in a very thoughtful but comprehensive way, that our history would remind us and teach us that there is another way forward, and that might allow for a different kind of discourse that would take place, with the reality that, yes, the Jewish community and its mainstream institutions are deeply committed to the American story, to all of these civil liberties and civil rights questions, but also have a particular boundary line upon which we will hold firm to how we proceed.
So I'm going to be arguing in a piece that I'm writing. I don't know if you'd call it a manifesto or not, but it might come close. That the Jewish community relations and advocacy field ought to fundamentally shift its coalitional relationships and commitments. And it would move, in my view, it should move, in my view, from sort of a progressive focus, which was put in place, particularly sort of after the Second Intifada, when we started to see the delegitimization of Israel, where the basic logic was there are fence sitters within the left, and we've got to influence their thinking on Jews in Israel, and let's engage them on social justice issues that we care about as well, but let's move them in our direction in a way that sensitizes them, to peel them away, let's say, from some of the far left intersectional politics. And that we should shift from those commitments to what I would consider a center-left to center-right coalition based on liberalism, based on traditional American liberalism, that we identify our partners on the center-right as well and on the center-left. And some of them might be overlapping with some of the former partners. In other words, there are African Americans, there are Asian Americans, particularly Asian Americans, by the way, who are not happy with the way that our politics is moving and feel disenfranchised. There are groups like that. There are Latinos, clearly, by the way, who are not voting, who are becoming increasingly conservative and are quite alienated from this brand of politics. So these may be our, in my view, coalition partners of the future, that we should start hammering out this new coalition for the Jewish community. What is your view on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I didn't refer to other ethnic and racial and religious communities that would share with us the similar sort of mindset of where we need to be. Walter Lurie, who was a real thought leader in the field of Jewish community relations, put out a book in the 1970s, as you know, David, The Principles of really Community Relations. And I think one ought to return to some of those principles. Those are not antiquated. They're very much in line with what I guess we would call authentic or responsible liberalism. And they afford us a chance to help frame this conversation that we need to have. And by the way, I'm not suggesting we boycott conversations with the folks who disagree with us or who hold these very strong perspectives about wokeism and critical race theory and intersectionality. In fact, I think we need to have such conversations. How they hopefully will hear us and how we will hear them will be the real secret or glue to this process. So as much as I will embrace this idea that we need to find a third way forward, part of the third way is that we don't walk away from conversations. We simply remind folks we come to this with credentials, with history, and with a very particular set of beliefs about how this all comes down.
One of the challenges I find in doing this, I've sort of gone off and started articulating these views, and I have a change agenda, right? We have a change agenda at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. We're trying to reinstill some of these ideas and values within the Jewish mainstream. And I found that there's a strong contingency, people that I've worked with in the past, who view any questioning of this orthodoxy as a kind of disqualification. I'll give you a very recent story. I don't actually know who the colleague is, but one of my colleagues said that a colleague of his within the Jewish community relations field, somebody who's widely respected, basically accused me of being racist because I questioned structural or systemic racism. Now, in everything I've ever written or talked about with systemic or structural racism, I have said that I believe that there probably is systemic and structural racism, but I want to look at it on a case-by-case basis, and I want there to be inquiry around that. I don't want to assume it's true just because people assert it's true in every case. And that I believe that it's important that we examine it and we examine other potential factors, because it's really important to understand the source of disparity. So that we can solve social problems that have been long dogged our country, and that we can't afford to be wrong or too ideological about them. And yet, for some reason, that lands on people as being, or certain people as being, inherently problematic or bigoted or racist. I mean, what do you make of that sort of prevailing attitude with, I don't know if it's a prevailing attitude, maybe it's a small percentage of people. How do you think I should think about that?
I think it is troubling, frankly, because I think the reality is we share similar outcomes. That is, we want to make sure that the racism that exists is ended, and that we find ourselves in a better place. But the notion of inquiry and the responsibility to do so in a measured and historic fashion, meaning looking at it through different case examples and understanding its different evolutions and its meanings is essential. In fact, part of what we need to do is to have everyone who suddenly comes to blows or to the cutting point of saying, I can't work with you, is to have them step back and to realize that in one another, we actually share some of the common outcomes and goals. We may at this moment be using language that we find either offensive to another or that they are finding difficult with us. But that language is not the battleground. The battleground is really the changing character of the society and is what is to be our product or end objective. And sadly, if all we can do is to argue how we address these themes is really hurtful to the victims of hatred and racism, and is certainly in a sense failing all of us. So I think we need to find another way to manage how we address one another.
Yeah, and I'm struggling to that. It's hard on the one hand both to put forth a set of ideas and say it's really important that we discuss and debate these ideas, and at the same time sort of be in peacemaking posture.
Yeah.
One of the challenges are several funders have come to me, or potential funders, have said, well, we do think that there's a problem, but we really want to be in peacemaking mode. And the problem I'm having is that I'm not sure that our side, by our side, I mean the people who support traditional liberalism, have yet come out of the woodworking are ready to come to the table. I think that there's a very organized voice on the progressive left in the Jewish community that has very strong views, has articulated them very forcefully, has made it harder and scared some people into silence, and that our first order of business is to bring out some of those voices from the woodwork so that they're in a position actually to negotiate and say, okay, let's find a set of values and guidelines that we can all live with. And I don't think we're there yet. But maybe I'll let you comment. Am I wrong about that?
It's an interesting observation, and you would know, frankly, better than I, because you're much more on the front lines at this point than certainly I am. But the ability to mobilize the center of our community, that is the moderate liberal voices, they are there, and they are there in huge numbers, and they are there probably not yet aware of the existence of groups such as yours and of efforts such as yours to help articulate, what we believe and how we act and where we go with these principles. So the first task is to really get the message out, which I think is a challenge unto itself. But the Jewish community is ripe, frankly, for the conversations that by necessity have to be held. And the center part of our community is clearly desperate, in my mind, to finding voices and leaders who will reflect what they believe and what they are looking for.
Well, we're going to do our best. I appreciate your thoughtful analysis as always. I appreciate your ability to cite larger trends in such a compelling, succinct way. And I look forward to continuing this discussion with you in the days ahead.
I do too. Thank you, and continued success with your work.
Thanks a million. Take care.